Good morning. In this week's Parsha of Korach, we read again about the rebellion against Moshe and Aaron, against Moshe's Torah leadership, against Aaron's spiritual leadership, the position of the leader of the Jewish people, the position of the Kohen Gadol. And Korach comes to say, Kol ha'edah kulam kadoshim, the entire congregation is holy. Why do you raise yourselves above them? And the Midrash tells us that Korach brought two particular claims against Moshe. The first one was to do with the talus, and the second one with the mezuzah. Fairly famous ideas. With the talus, we have a mitzvah that for every four-cornered garment, there are two requirements. One is that there will be tzitzit tied on the edge. You have these four strings which you double over and tie in knots. And the second requirement is that one of those four threads is dyed blue with tachelet, a special dye, which we haven't had for a long time and may or may not recently have been discovered. But it must be, that's the second mitzvah, is that one of those threads must be dyed blue. And Korach came forward with the presentation, according to the Midrash, with the claim that he says, if you have an entire talus, an entire garment dyed blue, do you still need to dye one of those threads blue, or can you leave all four of the threads white? And Moshe said, you still have to dye the threads. Then he came with his second claim, and he said, we have the mitzvah of mezuzah, that on every room you must stick a scroll with the first two paragraphs of the Shema and Ve'ahavta, and the Ve'haya'im Shamua. Click those on the door. He says, if you have a room where the entire room is filled with books of the Torah, do you still need the scroll on the doorpost? And Moshe said, yes. Now what's Korach getting at, the thinly veiled subtext of what he's saying, is that when you have holiness within the object itself, or within the group itself, why do you need a symbol at the edge? When the whole talus is dyed with this holy blue, why do you need one of the threads to also be blue? When the whole room is filled with books of the Torah, why do you need the scroll on the doorpost? If the whole community is holy, why do you need their leadership? And the Maharal of Prague takes it one step further. He says, why do we pick these two of the talus and the mezuzah? So firstly, the Midrash comes to this idea because the parsha just before Korach is the parsha of tzitzit. At the end of Shlach, we read about the tzitzit, and then immediately afterwards, we read about the rebellion of Korach. So the Midrash, the Torah itself, is already hinting towards this idea in the juxtaposition of those two ideas. But the Maharal says you have the tachelet, this blue thread, serving as an analogy for spiritual leadership. The blue thread is the holiness within the talus. And that is Aaron. Aaron was the holy one. And Korach was saying, if the whole community, if the whole talus is already blue and holy, so why do you need the holy one at the edge? And the second one was Torah leadership, knowledge, instruction, teaching. If you have the whole room full of books, why do you need the scroll of Torah at the entrance? Why do we need you, Moshe? We all understand the Torah. What purpose do you serve as the spiritual leader, as the Torah leader of the Jewish people? Now, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, if you think about it, Korach seemingly actually has a good claim. Because we have a Gemara in Menachot where Rabbi Meir says, why is it that Hashem says we've got to have this blue thread on the Techelet? Because the blue thread will remind you of the throne of Hashem's glory. The Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, Guide to the Perplexed, says that when we speak about the throne of Hashem, that is a metaphor for the greatness, the glory of God's presence. So when you look at the blue, you should think of the glory of God's presence, remember all of the mitzvot, and then fulfill them. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, so hold on a second. If just the thread dyed blue helps, so the whole talus dyed blue actually should help. Korach actually does have a good claim. Why do we throw him out? What he said is logical in terms of the reason that the Gemara has given. And so even, so you seemingly have a bind over here. You can either say, well, the Gemara wasn't being serious about it, which is not an acceptable answer because the Gemara was being serious about it. Or you can say, there was some problem in Korach's logic, but there doesn't seem to have been. And so, therefore, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein gives two answers to this question. Number one, he says, at the end of the day, we have the mitzvot from Hashem. As much as we understand them, as much as what we've said in explanation is true, there's always more to it. There's always greater depth. There's always levels of subtlety and insight and wisdom and esoteric ideas that are not revealed to us. And ultimately, when it comes to these things, we have to rely on Hashem. That's point number one. With all the logic in the world and all the justification in the world, you cannot change from the mitzvah which Hashem has given us. That's the first point that he says. The second point that he makes is that, in fact, there is a purpose to be served by having the blue only on the thread and not the entire thing. And that is, he says, that you are required to do some of the work. There are many times that a hint is more powerful educationally than revealing it outright. And you will see this many times with good teachers, that they won't just tell you the whole answer, they'll tell you a little bit of it, and then you have to work out the rest of it yourself. That was my attempt at an example of this. But they tell you a little bit of it, and you have to do some of the work. Through that, you are growing as a person, as a student. You're reaching greater levels of understanding. And that, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, was the entire problem of the generation of the desert. All of their spirituality was handed and presented to them. They had the greatest revelations we could ever imagine. As our sages tell us that even a maidservant at the sea had a greater revelation of God than the prophet Yechezkel. They were given the Torah at Mount Sinai. Sages tell us that the seven heavens opened and they had a vision of God himself on his throne. Again, this metaphor for the glory of God. We have this intense revelation of everything. But as a result, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, their faith was always limited to what they could see. They were never stretched. They were never asked to take the next step. And so even though they saw with their own eyes the downfall of Pharaoh and the destruction of Egypt, the most powerful empire in the world at the time, when they reach the land of Israel, they say, how can we enter? How can we come in? How can Hashem drive out the nations that live there? And when Hashem provides for them food from heaven in terms of the manna, every single day in the desert, they say, but could he give us meat? Can he do such a thing? Don't you understand what he's doing? That this shows that he can do everything. No. They only understood what they had in front of them, but they were never able to take it to the next step. Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Goldfein of blessed memory, quoted Rabbi Aaron Paperman saying about his rabbi, about Rabbi Goldfein's Rabbi Gifter, that Rabbi Paperman said, the difference between me and Rabbi Gifter is that when you teach me one thing, you've taught me something and I remember it. But when you teach Rabbi Gifter something, you've taught him 10 things. Because he understands that and he extrapolates and he follows it to the logical conclusions and he understands all of the implications he takes in everything. And that, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says, is what Korach was missing and what the whole generation was missing. The point is not to have the whole thing of blue. Very nice, then you got a blue talus. The point is to have a little thread of blue and you take it and you say, well, what does that mean? And in fact, if you look at that in that Gemara in Menachot, it takes it a few steps further. It says, well, you look at the blue of the talus and you remember the blue of the sea, and you look at the blue of the sea and you remember the blue of the sky. When you look at the sky, then you remember the throne of God's glory, because you have that active engagement and involvement from you yourself, which takes you to the next level. That was the problem that Korach made in thinking, let's just present the whole thing to them. When you give everybody a handout all the time, whether it's of knowledge or whether it's of something else, when you never ask from them, they never grow, and in fact, you're placing a ceiling on where they're able to reach. That's the first two ideas, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Idea number one is that at the end of the day, after all the good logic and reasons in the whole world, we have the mitzvah of Hashem, which we don't change. And reason number two, which is that the point is not to have the whole thing presented, but to understand step by step. Now, I've already said 9 minutes, so if you want to stop here, you're welcome. But if you want to hear a little bit more from the Maharal of Prague, he has a different take on this, which is fascinating, which explores in his book Tiferet Yisrael about understanding the Torah, chapter 22. He says what's happening over here is that what Korach didn't understand and what Hashem requires is contrast. He says holiness is not just something that exists in and of itself, but it is an emergent quality that comes from contrasting what is holy and what is not holy. The words of Rabbi David Aaron expressing essentially the same idea, that there is no such thing as sweet without sour. There is no Shabbat without the week. There is no Kodesh without Chol, no holy without general. These things only exist, no black without white. These things only exist and emerge from the contrast. And the analogy Rabbi David Aaron always gives is, he says, imagine that everything in the entire world was white. Everything was white, not even different shades of white. Everything was exactly the same thing. What would you see? So people say they would see white, but the answer is no, you would see nothing. Because you only understand white as a concept and as a color in contrast to other colors, other shades, other tones. And so it's the same thing. If everyone was holy, everyone would just be normal. You only have the idea of holiness if you have, in this case, one person, a position, who is dedicated, designated as extra holy. The way Rabbi Jonathan Sachs expresses a similar thing is that when you set aside, I think he was saying it about a shul or the temple, that when you set aside one place as absolutely designated for the presence of God, then every place can tap into a part of that. It's the same thing with a marriage. When you set aside one day as the anniversary, so every day you have a little bit of the anniversary. But unless you have that one day that you focus on making it special, everything just becomes regular, normal, routine, flat. You have no hills without valleys, no valleys without hills. The idea is that these qualities all emerge from contrast and that you need that contrast. And so the response, according to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, to Korach is, a totally blue-dyed talus does not serve the purpose, because a totally blue-dyed talus is flat. The purpose is to have the contrast between the white and the blue, and now you have blue. Now you have something that is different and exceptional, and that teaches you that lesson. In the same way, maybe the entire community is holy, but you need someone who is designated as the symbol of holiness, as the leader of holiness. And that was the purpose of Aaron. So this third explanation of the Maharal, what was wrong with Korach's claim? Yes, this blue thread reminds you of Hashem, so the whole thing blue, would it be better? No. Because it's not just that it's a blue thread, it's that it's a blue and not white thread. And through that contrast, through understanding, you have these emergent qualities. And that's the way we should understand with everything in life. You have Shabbat emerging from the 6 days of the week. Because you work 6 days a week, therefore Shabbat is something different. Because you have unholiness or lack of holiness, therefore you have holiness. And so too with all other such ideas and concepts. Shabbat Shalom.